Hello, my dear friends. They use the same comb for the whole family, clean their ears with a pen, and wash their bed sheets every few months. Imagine living with the smell of dried urine, with a shoe cloth next to a towel, and you're not seeing anything weird. What was considered Victorian hygiene will send a shiver down your spine. It's not just dirty, it's deadly dangerous. Tonight, you'll discover a world where cleanliness is the ultimate luxury. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you stepped into a Victorian home on a Saturday evening, you might find the entire family gathered around a single wooden tub filled with cloudy water. It stood in the centre of a small kitchen or by the fireplace, steam rising faintly at first, then fading as the night wore on. Bathing was a shared ritual, not a private one. The same water that had touched the father's work-stained skin would later be used by the mother, and finally by the children. It was not out of neglect, but of necessity. Water was expensive to heat, soap was precious, and cleanliness was a luxury that few could truly afford. The act of washing became a sequence, and by the time the youngest child entered the tub, what had once been warm and clear was little more than a lukewarm grey broth. It is hard not to imagine the smell, yet Victorians accepted it as part of the domestic order. The first to bathe was often the head of the household. His body carried the dust of labour or the scent of tobacco, and the surface of the water quickly grew dull with grime. The mother would take her turn next, dipping carefully, hoping that what remained of warmth might still cling to her skin. Children waited in silence, watching the floating debris circle the rim of the tub. It sounds absurdly unhygienic, but at the time, it was considered efficient and even respectable. To waste clean water was unthinkable. For the working poor, a single bucket had to serve for washing, cooking, and scrubbing floors. Bathing separately was a fantasy reserved for novels and nobility. The ritual took hours. Towels were scarce, so bodies were dried with old cloths or garments set aside for the purpose. The damp air filled the small room, and soot from the fire clung to the moisture, leaving a thin film on the walls. The floor grew slippery, and the smell of wet fabric mixed with the faint sweetness of cheap soap. There was no sense of shame in this process. Families talked, joked, and carried on as if nothing were unpleasant. Dirt, after all, was universal. Cleanliness was momentary. For the wealthy, conditions improved only slightly. Their tubs were lined with metal, and servants carried in buckets of hot water. But even in grand houses, the bath was seldom emptied after each use. Heating water took time and fuel, both costly commodities. The same bath might serve several members before being thrown out into the yard. Perfumed oils or herbal sachets were sometimes added to disguise the staleness, turning the water into a perfumed illusion of hygiene. In modern terms, it would be like sharing a single bathwater with your entire apartment building, each person adding a drop of cologne to pretend it was fresh. Servants bore the worst of it. They cleaned the tubs, hauled the buckets, and were often the last to wash, if they washed at all. In crowded servant quarters, a small basin was all they had, filled from the kitchen spout or a pump in the yard. The water might be reused to scrub boots or dishes afterward. Illness spread easily in such conditions, yet few made the connection between disease and the ritual of shared water. The prevailing belief held that visible dirt was the enemy, not bacteria. If the skin looked clean, it was clean enough. Children grew up thinking this routine was normal. They splashed in murky water, laughed at floating bits of soap or hair, and climbed out shivering but satisfied. Mothers wrapped them in coarse towels, proud that their family had bathed that week. To them, cleanliness was not about health, but about respectability. A washed face on Sunday morning meant dignity. No one questioned whether the same water had touched 6 bodies before theirs. Public bathhouses existed but were viewed with suspicion. They were crowded, loud, and considered morally questionable. Men and women bathed separately, yet gossip about indecency kept many families away. The irony was sharp. Those who avoided public baths for the sake of decency often lived surrounded by filth in private. It fascinates me how morality so often replaced practicality in Victorian life. The ideal of virtue outweighed the need for genuine hygiene. Doctors occasionally warned about infections from reused bathwater. Skin diseases, rashes, and even fevers were common, but explanations were vague. Germ theory was still new, and many thought illness came from bad air rather than contaminated surfaces. Bathing remained more symbolic than medical. To bathe together was to share warmth, to affirm unity, even if it meant sharing bacteria as well. The act bound the family quite literally through the same water. Over time, soap manufacturers and reformers began to promote personal cleanliness as a moral duty. Adverts showed cherubic children in spotless tubs, promising purity through purchase. But for most families, the cost of such comfort was far beyond reach. They continued their Saturday baths, unaware that the water they saved might cost them their health. The tub itself became a symbol of thrift and togetherness, though what it really held was the residue of poverty. Cleanliness, like everything else in the Victorian world, was measured by class. Evening came, the water cooled, and the last child stepped out, teeth chattering, skin tinged blue. The father might nod with satisfaction. The mother would pour what remained into the street drain, and the tub would be covered until next week. In that moment, they believed they had done their duty to decency. They could face Sunday with the confidence of the clean, even if their cleanliness was only skin deep. It is grimly amusing that a family could feel renewed by a bath that looked more like soup than water. Yet in a society obsessed with appearances, even filth could masquerade as virtue. Standing beside that tub, one could see both pride and despair coexisting quietly under the same roof. The ritual of the shared bath captured everything about Victorian life thrift, endurance, and illusion. The family believed they had conquered dirt, but all they did was rearrange it. Water was scarce, and ignorance was plentiful. What was left behind in the tub was not just grime, but a reflection of a world struggling to appear civilized. That night, as the last candle burned low, the house returned to stillness. The air was thick, the floor damp, and the scent of soap barely covered the smell of sweat. In the morning, clothes would be pressed and smiles returned, as if purity could last. Some habits, however, clung stubbornly to the body. There were still things they would never wash away. The family left the tub behind, believing themselves refreshed. Yet the dirt lingered, invisible but alive. Victorian women began each day by fastening layers of clothing that trapped heat, sweat, and dust close to the body. Beneath the corsets and petticoats lay a single piece rarely discussed yet constantly worn, the undergarment. It was not delicate lace but thick, stiff cotton or wool, designed more for modesty than comfort. Most women owned only a few pairs, sometimes just one. Washing them daily was out of the question. The fabric absorbed moisture and odour but took days to dry, and water itself was too precious to waste on what was unseen. The result was predictable. Garments meant to protect cleanliness instead became carriers of grime. It is quietly horrifying to think that what Victorians called decency was often soaked in days of sweat. Laundry was heavy labour, heating water, scrubbing cloth, wringing it out by hand. These tasks demanded time and strength that working women rarely had. Soap was expensive, drying to the skin, and used sparingly. Many preferred to hang their undergarments near a window to air them rather than wash them. The illusion of freshness was enough. Scented sachets or drops of perfume were tucked between layers to disguise the smell. In modern times, it would be like wearing the same gym clothes for days and spraying perfume over them before heading out. Yet within the tight moral codes of Victorian society, this was entirely acceptable. Clean appearance mattered more than actual cleanliness. The garments themselves were cumbersome, drawers tied at the waist, split at the crotch for convenience, and fastened with ribbons. They chafed against the skin, collecting dust and sweat beneath the corset's pressure. Women sat, walked, and slept in them. The friction caused rashes and sores, especially during warm months. Doctors of the time blamed female delicacy for such ailments, not the filthy fabric that clung to their bodies. Even gentlewomen who could afford more clothing often wore each piece for several days before sending it to the laundress. Servants washed their employers' linen first and their own last, sometimes not at all. In poor households, washing was a public act performed at the communal pump or riverbank. Women stood ankle-deep in cold water, scrubbing clothes until their knuckles split. It was easier to let undergarments go unwashed than endure the pain and chill. Some rinsed them quickly and hung them indoors, where damp fabric filled the air with a sour heaviness. Husbands complained, but few offered help. In many homes, women quietly accepted the burden of dirt as part of their duty. It is remarkable how resilience can turn into resignation when society calls it virtue. For those who worked in factories or as servants, the problem deepened. Long hours left no time for washing, and shared quarters offered little privacy. Undergarments were worn until they could no longer be tolerated, then turned inside out to extend their use. When finally washed, they were scrubbed harshly and boiled if possible, shortening their lifespan but not necessarily removing all filth. The odour of damp fabric became a constant companion, a scent of exhaustion that clung even after drying, yet to speak of it was taboo. The silence around bodily reality was one of Victorian society's strangest hypocrisies. Advertisements began to appear for laundry aids and scented soaps, but they targeted the middle class. The poor remained invisible, their hygiene judged yet unsupported. Even among the wealthy, washing intimate garments was considered improper to mention. Laundresses handled the task discreetly, their hands raw from bleach and lye. They carried home the residue of other people's respectability. In their cottages, tubs of grey water and piles of steaming linen told another story, the hidden labour that kept Victorian morality spotless in public and filthy in private. The combination of corsets, petticoats, and rarely washed underwear created a perfect breeding ground for infections. Skin could not breathe, moisture was trapped, and friction caused sores that festered. Doctors noticed the symptoms but rarely questioned the clothing. They prescribed tonics instead of soap. The female body, they said, was naturally fragile, ignoring that the very garments meant to protect modesty were damaging health. It was a quiet cruelty disguised as virtue. Cleanliness was a moral ideal, not a medical one, and suffering was simply part of womanhood. By the end of the century, reformers began to discuss hygiene more openly. Manuals encouraged women to change their linen frequently, yet even these guides assumed the reader had servants. For the majority, the advice was unreachable. Poverty and social pressure combined to make washing an act of privilege. Many women felt shame when they could not maintain the standard, though the standard itself was unreasonable. To appear clean was essential, to be clean was optional. The line between the two blurred until no one could tell the difference. Inside the quiet bedrooms of Victorian houses, undergarments hung from chairs or fireplace screens to dry. Their faint, sour odour mixed with the scent of candle wax and damp wool. Women woke and dressed quickly, fastening each layer again, preparing to meet the day as if purity could be achieved through endurance alone. There was dignity in the effort, if not in the result. It is oddly touching that they tried so hard to appear proper while living in conditions that made real cleanliness almost impossible. The truth beneath their gowns was simple and unpleasant. The foundation of Victorian respectability rested on unwashed fabric, pressed daily against the skin. Decency required concealment, and concealment bred decay. In a world that prized outward grace, the unseen could rot without notice. The smell of soap might linger in parlours, but in the layers beneath, another scent told the story of labour, fatigue, and denial. Underneath the corsets and cotton, women carried the proof of their society's contradictions. The dirt was invisible to others but undeniable to themselves. It was the price of propriety, paid in silence each day. They believed the layers of fabric preserved their dignity, yet those layers held their hidden decay. The silence around their bodies was heavier than the clothes they wore, and somewhere in that silence, the illusion of purity began to crumble. In the narrow streets of Victorian towns, where soot clung to brick and the air itself carried the scent of sweat, people found their own ways to stay dry. For those without handkerchiefs, sleeves became the most practical tool. Cloth was expensive, and few could afford extra pieces meant only for wiping a brow. A sleeve, already part of the body's daily armour, served well enough. It soaked up the moisture that gathered on the face, neck, and underarms. There was no sense of embarrassment in it, only habit. The mark of a hard-working person was not cleanliness but endurance. It is strangely humbling to think that the same sleeve used to shake hands or greet a neighbour might still be damp with yesterday's sweat. Handkerchiefs belonged to the middle and upper classes. They were stitched delicately, perfumed lightly, and shown proudly. To own one was to possess refinement. Among labourers, however, such niceties were pointless. Men wiped their brows with the backs of their hands. Women pressed sleeves to their faces while stirring pots or tending fires. Sweat ran freely through summer and winter alike. Factories and kitchens trapped heat, and bodies had to adapt. In a modern sense, it would be like replacing deodorant and tissues with the sleeve of your jacket and calling it practicality. The line between hygiene and survival blurred so completely that few noticed it existed at all. Clothing told stories. A dark patch under the arm, a faint yellow circle at the wrist, a hardened spot on the shoulder. Each was evidence of daily struggle. Soap could not erase them, and most garments were worn until they frayed. The stains became badges of labour, proof of effort. A clean shirt might signal idleness or privilege, while a stained one showed honesty and work. Society itself reinforced the idea. Respectable people might judge the poor for their smell, yet they still relied on them for labour that caused it. This quiet contradiction defined much of Victorian life. Women suffered most from the heat trapped beneath layers of fabric. Corsets compressed their ribs, petticoats clung to damp skin, and bodices absorbed every drop of perspiration. By midday, the underarms of dresses darkened, the edges stiffened, and the scent of salt and starch filled the air. Few could afford multiple changes of clothing. Laundry required both time and money, so garments were worn repeatedly until they were almost stiff with residue. Servants ironed these clothes in the evening, pressing the fabric smooth but sealing the sweat inside. The next morning, the same smell returned, faintly sweet and sour. Among men, especially labourers, the sleeve was almost an extension of the body. It wiped away soot, oil, blood, or sweat with equal indifference. On docks, in workshops, and along rail lines, sleeves darkened with grime that water rarely touched. The mixture of dirt and moisture hardened into layers, forming a second skin, yet this was never seen as disgraceful. Hard work justified everything. The clean-shaven gentleman might look down upon it, but even he relied on workers who toiled beneath the sun while his collar stayed white. It fascinates me how the meaning of cleanliness depends entirely on who can afford it. The smell of sweat filled every crowded space. Taverns, carriages, and tenements shared the same human odour. It was the scent of effort, of living without luxury. People grew accustomed to it the way they accepted smoke or dust. Only visitors noticed, recoiling at the mix of salt and damp fabric. For the locals, it was simply life. A passing breeze might bring momentary relief, but even the wind carried the smell of bodies working. The city itself seemed to perspire. Doctors began to associate sweat with illness. Though they misunderstood its cause, they advised moderation, not cleanliness. Some even argued that sweating purified the blood, so wiping it away too often might be harmful. This half-truth gave comfort to those who could not do better. They wore their stains with a kind of reluctant pride. The poorest never questioned whether the constant dampness beneath their clothes carried disease. They had more immediate worries: hunger, rent, survival. At home, sleeves served many purposes beyond wiping sweat. They cleaned children's faces, polished utensils, and brushed dust from tables. The same cloth that touched the skin also touched the food. Hygiene was a concept still forming, and boundaries between clean and dirty were fluid. When guests arrived, women might discreetly wet the edge of a sleeve to wipe a child's mouth. To them, it was care, not contamination. The act carried tenderness within its ignorance. Laundry days revealed the full picture. Clothes boiled in large pots gave off a sour steam, thick with the smell of old sweat. When lifted from the water, the stains faded but never vanished entirely. They reappeared soon enough, yellow and familiar. No one expected perfection. Even among the wealthy, servants struggled to keep garments spotless. The illusion of freshness was enough to maintain dignity. True cleanliness was impossible in a world where sweat never ceased and water was never plentiful. To wipe one's sweat with a sleeve was not an act of laziness but of adaptation. It spoke of lives lived too close to work, too far from comfort. The marks it left were not shameful, only human. They told of bodies that laboured, clothes that bore the burden, and a society that accepted dirt as the price of progress. It is quietly tragic that survival could be so intimate with filth, and yet so distant from relief. The Victorian belief in propriety depended on appearances, but beneath every polished surface lay fabric stiff with salt. To shake someone's hand was to meet the trace of their day's exhaustion. In the dim light of factories or homes, sleeves moved constantly, wiping, smearing, enduring. They carried the proof of life itself, unrefined and unacknowledged. Sweat did not just stain clothing, it stained the air, the streets, and the culture that refused to name its own dirt. It became the invisible fabric of daily existence, woven tightly with labour and silence. The sleeves dried, but the smell lingered in every thread. The stains told stories no soap could erase. And as the bodies kept working, a new form of filth quietly settled beneath the clean illusion of society. Victorian women treated their hair as a symbol of virtue, not as something to be cleaned often. Washing it too frequently was believed to invite illness, to weaken the body, or to dull the shine that society so admired. Instead of regular care, they relied on restraint. Weeks passed, sometimes an entire month, before water touched their scalp. The ritual of washing hair was laborious, and the fear of cold draughts or damp sickness lingered in every household. Water had to be boiled, carried, and cooled, while soap, harsh and alkaline, left hair feeling rough and stripped. For most women, it was easier to let dust and oil settle naturally. It is oddly ironic that what Victorians called beauty was often just well-arranged dirt. The act of washing hair began as a rare event, often on a Saturday evening before Sunday prayers. Women knelt by basins, their maids pouring warm water slowly over their heads. The soap used was not made for hair but for skin or clothes, leaving a residue that dulled the strands. Rinsing took several pitchers of water, each heavier than the last. Afterward, hair had to be combed, dried near the fire, and restyled into a tidy coil or bun. The process took hours. In cramped homes without servants, it was almost impossible. Many women simply brushed their hair daily, letting natural oils spread through it, believing this was cleansing enough. In modern times, It would be like using dish soap once a month and calling the result a beauty treatment. A woman's hair was a moral statement. Clean or not, it had to appear disciplined. Loose hair suggested carelessness or even impropriety. To keep their hairstyles intact, women avoided washing, preferring to dust their scalps with fine powders made from starch or orris root. These powders absorbed oil for a time but eventually mixed with sweat, forming a paste that clung to the roots. Some sprinkled rose water to mask the smell, others hid the odour beneath scented hats. From a distance, their hair looked immaculate, glossy in the light. Up close, it carried the faint sourness of sweat and perfume blended together. The illusion of purity was stronger than the desire for freshness. Brushing was the real ritual. Every night, hundreds of strokes through thick hair redistributed the oil, spreading it evenly until it shone. Brushes were prized possessions, with bristles of boar hair or bone stored carefully in velvet-lined cases. The act of brushing was slow, rhythmic, and almost meditative. It was said to stimulate the scalp and purify the mind. For many women, this was the closest they came to washing. A clean scalp was a private hope rather than a regular achievement. Dust gathered at the roots, yet they told themselves it was nature's polish. Servants, who had neither time nor luxury, tied their hair up quickly each morning and left it untouched for days. In hot kitchens or damp cellars, steam and soot settled into every strand. When the smell became unbearable, they sprinkled flour or cornmeal to dull it. Their hair grew stiff, chalky, and fragile, but complaints were useless. The sight of a maid with her hair washed too often might even invite reprimand. It suggested vanity. Respectable service required a balance of obedience and neglect. The upper class had the same habits, only better disguises. Ladies wore silk caps at night and perfumed pomades by day. Hairdressers visited to reshape curls and buns, sometimes reusing old hairpieces that carried traces of previous owners. In parlours filled with heavy scent, few noticed the underlying staleness. Cleanliness was secondary to composition. As long as a woman's hair looked arranged, it did not matter what it contained. It fascinates me how the appearance of virtue so easily replaced the pursuit of health. Men were little better. Barbers offered hair oil and tonic, not cleanliness. The fashionable man polished his hair with pomade until it gleamed like lacquer, the mixture of oil and sweat sealing his scalp beneath a sticky layer. Hats trapped the heat, leaving behind a sour odour when removed. But in portraits and parlours, they appeared impeccable, the smell hidden under cologne and civility. For most Victorians, washing the head was not just difficult but dangerous. They believed wet hair made one vulnerable to colds, fevers, and even madness. Doctors reinforced this fear, advising moderation and protection from drafts. A woman stepping outside with damp hair risked both gossip and illness. The simple act of washing became a moral and medical hazard, avoided out of both caution and conformity. In this strange logic, neglect was wisdom, and filth was safety. Over time, hair absorbed the world around it: coal dust, candle smoke, kitchen grease, and perfume. Each strand became a record of the city itself, a dark archive of daily life. In photographs, the sheen still looks elegant, but it was a beauty earned through denial. Behind every polished bun was a month of grime hidden beneath pins and ribbons. When finally washed, the water turned brown, carrying away not just dirt but weeks of silence and habit. The smell of unwashed hair became part of the household air, combined with wool, soap, and sweat. It created an aroma that was unmistakably Victorian. In that scent lay both endurance and ignorance. The belief that discipline could substitute for hygiene. Women prided themselves on order, yet their scalps itched, their brushes filled with dust, and their hats absorbed everything they wished to conceal. Cleanliness, like modesty, was performed rather than practiced. The truth was simple. No one in Victorian society truly had clean hair. The poor could not afford it, and the rich did not dare attempt it too often. A civilization that celebrated refinement built its elegance upon residue. The gloss of propriety was only the surface of neglect. It is almost comical to imagine the empire of progress powered by heads that had not touched water in weeks. The world they created valued restraint above reason. Their hair remained bound, their habits unchanged, and their pride intact. Beneath the ribbons and pins, each scalp carried the story of a time when cleanliness was feared more than filth. The curls stayed pinned, the powder settled, and the air filled with fragrance masking decay. Washing could wait until next month, or perhaps longer. After all, the appearance of purity was still intact. They walked proudly beneath wide hats, believing the scent of roses made them refined. Beneath those layers of powder and perfume, decay whispered quietly. And in that whisper, the illusion of beauty began to rot. Victorian mouths rarely knew the feel of true cleanliness. For most people, brushing their teeth meant little more than grinding rough powders against them until the gums bled. Toothbrushes existed, but they were carved from bone and fitted with boar bristles, costly items reserved for the wealthy. The rest of society made do with what they had: fingers, salt, and soot. Every morning or evening, they dipped a wet fingertip into crushed charcoal or coarse salt, then rubbed it against their teeth until a metallic taste filled the mouth. The sensation was harsh but familiar. They believed the sting meant purity. It is strange how pain so easily became a measure of cleanliness. The mixture of salt and charcoal scoured away surface grime, but also enamel. Teeth grew brittle, yellowed, and uneven. Gums receded and bled. Yet people felt proud of their effort. In an age before dental science, discomfort was simply proof that something worked. Those who could afford imported tooth powder flaunted it in decorative tins on their dressing tables. The rest relied on home remedies passed through families, ashes from the hearth, powdered brick, or even crushed eggshells. In modern times, it would be like using sandpaper and kitchen salt instead of toothpaste and calling it good hygiene. Still, among Victorians, such practices were viewed as sensible, even thrifty. The mouth was a private battlefield. Without proper brushes or clean water, decay set in early. The diet of the poor, heavy bread, cheap meat, and syrupy sweets only hastened it. Cavities blackened teeth. Infections swelled gums until speech and eating became painful. Yet the idea of visiting a dentist terrified most people. Dentistry was crude and costly, performed without anesthesia, and associated with needless suffering. Pulling teeth was cheaper than treating them. It was not uncommon to see young adults with gaps where molars once stood, smiling shyly behind closed lips. For the upper class, the situation was only slightly better. Tooth powders containing alum, chalk, or even mercury promised a dazzling smile but often corroded the enamel instead. Advertisements spoke of pearl-like whiteness, but the ingredients were closer to poison than polish. Some added a few drops of peppermint oil or rosewater to disguise the bitterness, creating a faintly pleasant taste that masked the damage. Servants prepared these mixtures each morning, stirring fine powders in small porcelain bowls. The ritual looked elegant but carried the same harm as the poor man's soot. Bad breath was common, so people relied on cloves, mint, or liquor to disguise it. Perfumed waters were sold as mouth rinses, but they did little beyond scenting decay. In crowded parlours or taverns, conversation carried faint traces of rot. It was a shared odour of the age, tolerated because it was universal. Etiquette guides suggested breathing gently when speaking closely, though few followed this advice. It fascinates me how society learned to ignore the smell of its own decay simply because it belonged to everyone. The combination of poor dental care and sugar-laden diets led to widespread tooth loss. False teeth made from ivory or human remains were popular among those who could pay. Some dentures came from grave robbers or were purchased from the mouths of the desperate. These gruesome substitutes were polished and refitted, then displayed with pride. Smiling was no longer a gesture of health, but a signal of wealth. Beneath the appearance of civility lay something far more macabre. Among the working class, toothaches were a part of life. People resorted to home remedies, holding a hot brick to the cheek, rinsing with vinegar, or applying whiskey-soaked cloths to numb the pain. When infection turned unbearable, a local barber or blacksmith might extract the tooth with pliers. There was no anesthesia, only endurance. The scream was part of the process. Afterward, the wound was left to heal on its own, often becoming worse, yet no one questioned it. Suffering was considered natural, even virtuous. Inside Victorian homes, oral care was an act of survival rather than self-respect. The wealthy performed it with ritual precision, the poor with brute simplicity. Both were wrong in different ways. Soap and salt could not replace science, and superstition could not substitute for hygiene. The result was a population that smiled through pain, believing the ache beneath the gums was simply the cost of being human. Children learned these habits early. Parents dipped their small fingers into salt and guided them across tiny teeth, proud of the effort. Blood on the gums was dismissed as enthusiasm. Charcoal left dark streaks along lips, giving even clean faces a ghostly cast. Over time, people accepted the stains, the smell, and the bleeding as ordinary. Cleanliness had been achieved, at least in appearance. The truth, however, sat deeper, invisible until too late. Dentists who tried to educate the public faced mockery. Few believed that gentle cleaning could do more good than harsh scrubbing. Many considered cavities signs of weakness rather than neglect. Progress came slowly, through pamphlets and public lectures that reached only the literate. Even then, vanity often won over reason. A chalky smile looked pure enough, and that illusion mattered more than comfort. By the late Victorian period, imported toothbrushes became more available, but habits die hard. Generations raised on salt and soot continued their old routines, distrusting new inventions. Toothpaste in jars appeared, yet many saw it as an unnecessary luxury. Only in the early 20th century did true oral hygiene begin to take hold. Until then, the Victorian smile remained something to be admired from afar but avoided too closely. It is almost comical that a society obsessed with politeness could not bear the truth behind its own breath. Clean words and filthy mouths, powdered faces and rotting teeth. This was the quiet irony of refinement built upon decay. The Victorians believed that discipline and effort could purify anything, even pain. They rubbed harder, bled more, and mistook suffering for success. Their mouths told the story of a civilization that valued appearance over understanding. The salt stayed on the tongue, the charcoal stained the lips, and the pain was swallowed with silence. They smiled still, proud of the effort if not the result. Their fingers left black dust across their teeth, proud of their work. But each rub stripped away more than stains. It erased the line between care and harm. And what remained was the taste of ignorance, bitter and enduring. For most Victorians, privacy ended where necessity began. The simple act of relieving oneself was not performed behind doors or within tiled rooms, but in corners, chambers, and courtyards. Indoor toilets were rare luxuries, reserved for grand houses with plumbing that few understood and fewer maintained. Ordinary families used chamber pots, small porcelain or metal bowls tucked beneath the bed or hidden behind curtains. At night, when streets were dark and outhouses distant, the pot became indispensable. In the morning, it was emptied into gutters or open drains that lined the roads. The air outside already carried the stench of coal smoke and damp wood, but the odour of waste made it unmistakably human. It is unsettling to think that the streets of progress were paved not just with stone, but with the residue of everyday life. A chamber pot was a household object as common as a chair or spoon. Families kept several, each assigned its quiet duty. Servants were responsible for cleaning them, Though often without gloves or disinfectant, the task was routine and degrading, yet as invisible as the people who performed it. In poorer homes, the pot served multiple occupants, emptied only when full. Some used wooden buckets or cheap tin versions that rusted over time. The sound of liquid hitting metal echoed faintly through the night, a reminder that sanitation was a privilege, not a right. In a modern home, the same act would be considered unthinkable. Yet for Victorians, it was simply life continuing as usual. The disposal of waste followed no consistent rule. Streets sloped toward open drains where rain and filth mixed freely. Public cesspits overflowed with alarming regularity, spreading not just odour but disease. During hot months, the air thickened, and even the wealthy could not escape the smell. Curtains were drawn, and flowers were placed in rooms to disguise the stench, though nothing could truly mask it. The scent of waste clung to walls, fabrics, and even skin. For those living near factories or slaughterhouses, it was simply another note in the symphony of filth that defined the city. In working-class neighbourhoods, outhouses stood at the far end of courtyards, shared by several families. They were small wooden huts, often leaning, their doors missing latches. A hole in the ground served as the receptacle, lined occasionally with lime to reduce the smell. It rarely helped. In rain, the pits filled. In winter, they froze. Children feared them, and adults endured them. The danger of falling in was real enough to make every visit cautious. Rats lived beneath, feeding on what humans left behind. Flies hovered constantly, their buzzing part of the daily soundscape. Inside the houses of the poor, sanitation blurred with survival. Buckets of waste stood near basins of water, sometimes within arm's reach of where food was prepared. The mingling of tasks was not negligence, but necessity. Women cleaned the pots while cooking or washing laundry, their hands moving between filth and food without pause. Water fetched from pumps was already questionable, often drawn from wells near cesspits. To live in such conditions was to gamble with health every day, though few connected their sickness to their surroundings. The invisible nature of germs allowed denial to flourish. The upper classes were not immune to the problem. Though some possessed indoor toilets, they relied on fragile plumbing prone to leaks and foul odours, pipes vented into cellars or gardens, spreading the same stench that plagued the streets. Servants managed the waste, hauling it discreetly away. Yet accidents were common. Even in marble-floored mansions, the air could carry a faint reminder of what lay beneath. It fascinates me how elegance in that era existed only a few inches above decay. Public facilities existed, but were far from sanitary. Common privies, used by dozens daily, became breeding grounds for disease. The floors were slick, the walls etched with grime, and the stench so strong that some preferred the streets instead. The result was predictable. Every morning, gutters ran with diluted filth, a slow river carrying the city's secrets away. Scavengers known as night soil men worked before dawn, emptying cesspits and hauling barrels through alleys. Their work was despised yet essential, their presence tolerated only in darkness. The smell of human waste was constant. It mixed with the scent of smoke, wet wool, and spoiled food until it became the background of a life. People no longer noticed it unless it grew unbearable. Perfumed handkerchiefs and burning incense offered brief relief, but the air always reclaimed its heaviness. Even churches and theatres carried traces of it, lingering beneath the perfume and polished wood. Clean air was a luxury known only to those who could flee the city altogether. Disease thrived in this environment. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread through contaminated water, cutting through entire neighbourhoods in weeks. Doctors debated causes, blaming bad air or divine punishment, rarely acknowledging that the waste beneath their feet was the real culprit. Reform came slowly, driven by scandal rather than compassion. Only when epidemics reached the wealthy did sanitation become a matter of urgency. Even then, improvements were uneven, and many continued to live surrounded by the same dangers for decades. Within homes, the routine persisted. At night, the pot was placed discreetly under the bed. At dawn, it was carried out, its contents thrown into the yard or gutter. The act was mundane, unspoken, and universal. Mothers scolded children for carelessness. Men pretended the chore did not exist, and servants cleaned in silence. The system functioned because no one questioned it too deeply. Shame was muted by necessity. The Victorians prided themselves on order and decency, yet their world rested on the foundations of waste. The same hands that served tea and wrote letters also carried filth to the street. Their civility ended where the chamber pot began, and everyone pretended not to notice. It is almost comical that a society obsessed with manners ignores the most basic form of cleanliness beneath its own roofs. Civilization in that time was measured by restraint, not sanitation. They lived among smells they refused to name and endured discomfort they called normal. Beneath their polished manners lay a truth as unyielding as the stench itself. The morning air carried both the scent of breakfast and the faint trace of the night before. Streets gleamed with moisture that no one wanted to identify. Life went on, dignified on the surface, decaying beneath. The chamber pot was emptied, but the odour lingered on every wall. The city breathed its waste like air, unaware of its poison. And somewhere in that stench, the illusion of progress began to rot. Victorian streets were filled with fragrance, but it was not the scent of cleanliness. It was a mixture of sweat, smoke, and heavy perfume, layered so thickly that even fresh air seemed perfumed. Personal hygiene was minimal, yet appearances mattered immensely. The answer to every odour was not soap, but scent. Men dabbed cologne on their collars, women sprinkled perfume on handkerchiefs and hair. The result was a society that glistened under the weight of its own aroma. It is strange to imagine that the empire of refinement smelled like flowers and decay at the same time. Perfume was not simply a luxury, it was a disguise. The human body, rarely washed and tightly bound beneath layers of fabric, released its own truth through scent. Armpits, mouths, and skin left uncleaned for days created a background of musk that no one dared name. To cover it, Victorians turned to oils and extracts distilled from roses, lavender or ambergris. These fragrances were strong, almost overwhelming, meant to fight odour by suffocating it. In modern terms, it would be like spraying an entire bottle of cologne after skipping a shower for a week. The logic was simple. If you could not remove the smell, you could overwhelm it. Women favoured floral perfumes that clung to fabric and hair. They sprinkled them inside gloves and on corsets, hoping the scent would linger as they moved through parlours and streets. Men preferred musk and sandalwood, bold and assertive smells that spoke of strength. Together, these odours filled every gathering until the air itself felt thick. It was not unusual for fainting to occur in crowded ballrooms, blamed on tight corsets but often worsened by the fumes of competing perfumes. A sweet rot hung in the air, both intoxicating and nauseating. In working-class homes, perfumes were rarer, but the instinct to mask odour remained. Cheap-scented waters and pomades offered an illusion of sophistication. Housewives dabbed floral oils behind their ears before church, and men rubbed their necks with lemon peels or herbs. The effort was touching in its sincerity, though the result was usually a blend of soap residue and sweat. To the Victorian nose, however, this mixture was comforting. It meant effort, respectability, and self-control. Real cleanliness was less important than the appearance of civilization. The obsession with scent extended into daily life. Handkerchiefs were soaked in perfume to counteract the smells of the street. Gentlemen pressed them to their faces when passing the poor, pretending to be delicate while breathing through linen soaked in alcohol and flowers. Women carried small silver vinaigrettes containing aromatic salts to revive themselves from faintness or stench. Perfume was armor, invisible but powerful, guarding dignity in a world without proper sanitation. It fascinates me how scent became both protection and illusion, a mask everyone agreed to wear. Yet beneath the fragrance, bodies continued to decay in slow motion. The skin, never fully clean, carried layers of sweat and powder. Breath soured from untreated teeth. Clothes absorbed smoke and oils. The mixture formed a personal signature that no perfume could erase. Lovers knew each other by scent more than by sight. Intimacy meant confronting the reality beneath the flowers. To embrace someone was to breathe in their life, unwashed and perfumed at once. Doctors occasionally warned of the dangers of strong perfume, claiming it could weaken the nerves or disturb the senses. There was some truth in it. Many fragrances were made with alcohol and toxic chemicals, yet few listened. The alternative, smelling of the human body, was unthinkable. For Victorians, the body was something to hide, its functions to be denied. Perfume allowed them to pretend that flesh could be spiritual, that decay could be elegant. Manufacturers grew wealthy from this denial. Shops sold ornate bottles, promising refinement and purity. Perfume became a mark of class, a signal that one was above the filth of the streets even while breathing it. The irony was sharp the more perfumed a person, the closer they were to the very filth they wished to deny. The scent of roses in the air was never just floral. It was the smell of desperation for control. At home, scents filled every corner. Curtains absorbed perfume from passing skirts, pillows carried the smell of hair oils, and gloves held the trace of hands that rarely touched soap. Even letters carried fragrance, sealed with wax and a drop of scent to announce the sender's refinement. But the longer the correspondence lasted, the more rancid the perfume became, mixing with the must of paper and time. It lingered, faint but insistent, a ghost of a cleanliness that never existed. For the poor, the odour of sweat was unavoidable, yet even they internalized the belief that natural smell meant shame. Women carried sachets of lavender, and men chewed herbs to sweeten breath. They could not afford to hide the truth completely, but they learned to soften it. The dream of smelling pure belonged to everyone, even if it could never be achieved. Perfume was civilization's answer to the body's rebellion. It spoke of restraint, but also of denial. Every drop represented an attempt to rise above nature, to turn sweat into roses and decay into art. The success was partial at best. The scent lingered beautifully in the air but failed to touch what caused it. The result was an entire era perfumed into forgetfulness. It is almost comical that an age obsessed with moral purity relied on perfume to hide its own stench. The same society that spoke endlessly of virtue could not bear the smell of its own humanity. The perfume bottles were refilled, the air thickened, and the illusion continued. The Victorians believed they could mask the truth forever. They left the house wrapped in fragrance, believing it made them divine. But the flowers wilted quickly, and beneath the scent of roses the human smell always returned. It never left, it only waited. In the parlours of the Victorian elite, the air shimmered with perfume and candlelight, but beneath the silk and satin lingered another scent entirely. The odour of the human body, warm, sour, and unmistakably alive, was not just tolerated but accepted as a mark of authenticity. Cleanliness was considered suspicious, an indulgence of those with too much time or too little wisdom. To smell of soap was to risk appearing frivolous. True refinement, they believed, came from restraint, from resisting the urge to tamper with the body's natural state. It is unsettling to think that aristocratic grace once carried the scent of unwashed skin and powdered decay. The upper class regarded bathing as unnecessary and, at times, dangerous. Doctors warned that frequent washing could weaken the nerves or open the pores to illness. Water was not trusted. It was thought to carry disease and moral decline. The wealthy took comfort in the belief that dirt protected them from both. Instead of bathing, they changed linen. Layers of fresh clothing were seen as cleansing substitutes. The ritual of dressing each morning, corsets, underskirts, petticoats, created the illusion of purity without a drop of water. In today's terms, it would be like changing your bedsheets daily but never washing your body beneath them. The result was a world that looked pristine but smelled otherwise. Servants bore the brunt of this contradiction. They aired garments, sprinkled perfume on gowns, and brushed coats coated with sweat and dust. Every crease held the evidence of a body that had not been washed in weeks. Yet touching soap or water too freely was considered vulgar, something fit only for the working class. Bathing belonged to labourers, to those who needed to scrub themselves of soot and mud. The refined body, by contrast, was meant to remain untouched, preserved like art. The scent of the human form was proof of vitality, a natural perfume that confirmed one's authenticity. Ballrooms glistened with heat. Beneath chandeliers, women in silk gowns moved gracefully, but the air around them grew heavy. Perfumes mingled with sweat until the fragrance turned thick and sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. Fans fluttered desperately, but the odour clung. Gentlemen encased in wool and starch produced their own aroma, stale tobacco, pomade, and the faint musk of confinement. Together, they created an atmosphere both intoxicating and suffocating. It was not impolite, it was expected. Guests might complain privately, but no one dared suggest that a duchess should wash more often. Bathing, when it occurred, was an event rather than a routine. A single tub was filled with water scented by herbs or vinegar, used by several members of the household in turn. The lady of the house might bathe once a month, or even less. Some believed a full-body wash was indecent. Only hands and faces were cleansed daily. Hair, too, remained untouched by water for weeks, preserved with powder and pins. The rest of the body was managed through perfume, powder, and the constant changing of linen. It fascinates me how the very idea of purity could be twisted into a fear of cleanliness. Among the nobility, scent became a language of its own. Each person carried a recognizable blend of perfume and body odour, unique as a signature. Lovers recognized one another in darkened rooms by smell before sight. The fragrance of a noblewoman's gown could linger in corridors long after she'd left, leaving both fascination and faint discomfort behind. In this strange world, the body's decay was not denied but romanticized. To smell human was to prove one's existence. To smell sterile was to risk appearing artificial. The belief had roots in religion and superstition alike. Water, especially cold water, was linked to sickness and sin. Moralists warned that bathing invited vanity and temptation. To remain unwashed was to remain virtuous. It was an elegant form of denial, allowing the privilege to confuse neglect with discipline. Servants washed because they had to. Their cleanliness marked their servitude. The upper class stayed dry and proud, their filth wrapped in brocade. Even furniture bore the traces of this unspoken truth. Upholstered chairs absorbed body odours, bedsheets darkened with oils and sweat, and gloves carried the faint musk of hands long unwashed. Candles and incense masked only part of it. Visitors entering a drawing room might first notice the scent before the decor, yet no one spoke of it. Etiquette required silence about anything too human. Smell was intimate, and intimacy was dangerous. Doctors eventually began to connect hygiene with health, but the message reached the poor before it touched the wealthy. Working-class families, accustomed to dirt, welcomed washing as progress. The rich clung to their perfumes and powders, unwilling to admit that cleanliness could be fashionable. Progress came not through logic, but through embarrassment. As cities modernized, the smell of privilege became harder to bear. New wealth, eager to appear civilized, embraced baths and soaps as symbols of sophistication. The old aristocracy was left behind, scented like relics of another age. Inside the great houses, the transformation was slow. Bathrooms were installed but rarely used. Servants filled tubs that remained cold until the water turned murky. The ritual of bathing still felt risky, intrusive, almost sinful. Only when death or scandal struck did some families begin to change their habits. Even then, perfume remained essential, the last defense against the body's truth. Clean water could not compete with centuries of denial. By the end of the century, society began to shift. Medical journals praised bathing, advertisements celebrated soap, and the scent of roses gave way to the smell of lye. Yet even then, the memory of unwashed elegance lingered like an old perfume, faint, sour, and persistent. It is almost comical that a civilization so obsessed with class used odour as proof of its superiority. The more refined they claimed to be, the further they drifted from the simplest form of cleanliness. The gowns remained bright, the chandeliers gleamed, and the air still shimmered with perfume. Yet beneath it all, the same scent of decay whispered through every dance and dinner. They moved gracefully through the glittering halls, convinced their smell marked nobility. But behind the fragrance and silk, the human rot clung quietly, and no one dared breathe too deeply. Victorian beds were symbols of comfort, yet few places in the home were filthier. Beneath lace canopies and heavy quilts lay sheets that rarely saw water. Washing linen was expensive and laborious, a task reserved for servants who spent entire days boiling fabric and wringing it dry by hand. As a result, bed sheets were changed only every few months, sometimes just once a season. During that time, they absorbed everything: sweat, oil, dust, and the faint residue of candle smoke that clung to every room. Night after night, the body left its silent mark upon the fabric, until the sheets carried the memory of their owner's every breath. It is quietly revolting to think that dreams unfolded atop months of accumulated grime. The weight of bedding itself discouraged cleanliness. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, horsehair, or wool, materials that trapped moisture and warmth, the perfect invitation for insects. Bedbugs and lice thrived in the seams, nesting unseen beneath embroidered covers. When the itching began, servants beat the mattresses with rods, sending a fine cloud of dust and life into the air, yet few replaced them. Mattresses were too costly to refill, and bed frames too cumbersome to clean. To disguise the stains, people simply turned the sheets over or spread darker fabric on top. In modern terms, it would be like flipping a dirty pillowcase and calling it fresh. The illusion of tidiness mattered more than the fact of filth. For the poor, the situation was worse. Entire families shared a single bed, their bodies pressed together for warmth in rooms where air barely moved. The sheets, if there were any, might be coarse sacks or old blankets passed down from others. Washing was nearly impossible without access to hot water or space to dry. The result was a cycle of dirt that began in infancy and ended in death. Children grew up with the same bedding that had held their parents, the same smells and stains woven into the cloth. Even in sleep, poverty was inescapable. Among the wealthy, bed linens were finer but not necessarily cleaner. Servants laundered them only occasionally, following the rhythms of the household rather than the needs of hygiene. Each change required gallons of water and hours of labour. Fabrics of silk or damask could not be scrubbed too harshly, so they remained dingy beneath the surface. To maintain appearances, households selected darker shades, cream, beige, or patterned linen that concealed the yellowing. A lady's bedroom might look pristine in daylight, yet the faint odour of body and dust told a different story. It fascinates me how elegance so often depended on what could be hidden, not what was pure. The bed itself became a stage where appearance triumphed over health. Pillows grew heavy with hair oil and skin flakes, yet were rarely washed. Blankets, used year after year, absorbed the scent of sweat and perfume until they formed their own atmosphere. Visitors praised the softness of a guest bed without knowing its history. Even hospital beds were changed infrequently, spreading infection quietly from one patient to another. Linen served as both comfort and carrier, soothing the sick while carrying the disease. Household manuals of the time did mention the importance of clean bedding, but their advice revealed how little was understood. They suggested airing sheets by hanging them near open windows rather than washing them, believing sunlight alone could purify. On damp days, sheets were shaken and beaten, spreading the dust back into the air. The scent of lavender sachets or vinegar water was used to disguise lingering odours. These methods offered reassurance but no relief. The fabric remained the same, only the smell changed. Servants who handled the washing paid the heaviest price. The work was brutal, scrubbing linen in boiling water, lifting it while still scalding, then wringing it dry. Their hands cracked and bled, their lungs filled with steam and lye. In large households, laundry days filled the yard with wet sheets flapping like pale ghosts. Yet even after such effort, the process was too costly to repeat often. Weeks passed before another washing day, and the beds filled again with the quiet residue of life. For those who lived without servants, washing day was an ordeal. Women bent over tubs until their backs ached, the smell of soap and sweat filling the small rooms. The water cooled too quickly, forcing them to reheat it over fires. Children played beside them, unaware of the dirt that surrounded their rest each night. To lie down in a clean bed was a rare luxury. Most accepted the faintly greasy texture of their sheets as normal, just another fact of Victorian existence. In winter, the situation grew worse. Cold air discouraged washing, and frozen water made it nearly impossible. Blankets thickened with months of unwashed use. The warmth they provided came at a cost to the heavy, sour smell of fabric that had absorbed every secret of the body. People slept deeply in that odour, unaware that even rest carried its own contamination. To them, cleanliness was something for the living hours. Night belonged to fatigue, not purity. Doctors began to notice the connection between dirty bedding and illness. Cases of fever, skin infection, and even respiratory disease were traced to unwashed linens. Yet advice to change sheets more often fell on deaf ears. For most, it was impractical. For the rest, it was unnecessary. The scent of sleep was part of life, and the idea of starting each night on fresh linen felt excessive, almost wasteful. Beds were meant to hold the body, not to question it. It is almost comical that a civilization obsessed with purity began and ended each day in filth. The same people who powdered their faces and polished their shoes slept surrounded by everything they pretended to avoid. By dawn, the sheets had absorbed another night's warmth, another layer of invisible residue. Curtains fluttered faintly in stale air, and the cycle began again. Clean or not, the bed was always waiting. They woke refreshed, believing rest had washed them clean. Yet the dirt lay beneath their dreams, patient and silent, and with every night that passed, the boundary between sleep and decay grew thinner. In Victorian households, a comb was not a personal possession but a shared tool, passed from hand to hand like a loaf of bread at supper. It rested on the dressing table, a simple object of bone or wood, waiting for its turn each morning. Mothers used it first, pulling it through hair stiff with oil or dust, then passed it to daughters. Fathers and sons borrowed it after, often without wiping away what clung between the teeth. Hair, once smooth, gathered residue with every stroke. Flakes of skin, strands of hair, traces of pomade and sweat. Yet no one thought it unsanitary. Sharing was a sign of closeness, not contamination. It is quietly horrifying that affection could spread lice as easily as warmth. Cleanliness, as Victorians understood it, belonged to surfaces and appearances. The notion of personal hygiene had not yet reached their tools. Brushes, combs, and pins were communal by default. In homes without plumbing, Water was rationed for drinking and cooking, not for cleaning accessories. A quick wipe on a sleeve or rag was considered sufficient. Dust and dandruff collected over time, but the object remained in use, its handle polished by countless fingers. In modern homes, it would be like sharing the same toothbrush with everyone and calling it a family habit. The thought was practical then, disgusting now. Hair itself required care that few could afford. The wealthy hired maids to maintain elaborate styles. The poor relied on a single comb to tame tangles. For women, especially, hair was both burden and pride. Long and heavy, it caught smoke, grease, and odour easily. A shared comb made daily grooming faster, but also spread everything unseen. When itching began, people assumed it was the weather or poor diet, not the silent migration of lice from one scalp to another. Powdered starch or vinegar rinses offered temporary relief but never solved the problem. It was easier to endure the irritation than to challenge a habit that felt natural. In cottages and tenements, combs were simple objects carved from horn or soft wood, their teeth uneven and fragile. When one broke, it was repaired or glued, never discarded. They passed through generations, their age measured not in years but in scratches and stains. In wealthier homes, silver or ivory combs gleamed on dressing tables, but their elegance hid the same unhygienic truth. Servants cleaned them occasionally, running cloth between the teeth, though rarely with water. The idea that bacteria or fungi might exist there was unknown. A clean comb looked clean. Children suffered most from the practice. They shared beds, clothes, and combs, carrying infestations from home to school and back again. Teachers often remarked on the constant scratching in classrooms. Mothers combed their daughters' hair beside the fire at night, murmuring about health while spreading infection with each stroke. The comfort of the act disguised its danger. The crackle of the fire, the rhythm of brushing, it all felt intimate, loving, ordinary. In those moments, care and contamination became indistinguishable. Even the upper class was not immune. Beneath jewelled hairpins and ribbons, lice thrived in powdered wigs and perfumed curls. The heat and moisture beneath heavy coiffures created the perfect breeding ground. Hairdressers who tended to multiple clients carried infestations unknowingly from one head to another. A lady might spend hours having her hair arranged for an evening ball, unaware that each touch of the comb transferred more than beauty. Servants whispered about the small white specks they found on fine linen pillows, but no one spoke of it openly. Decorum demanded silence, even about parasites. Doctors noticed the pattern, but offered little practical advice. Remedies ranged from vinegar to kerosene, both painful and unreliable. Most households ignored medical warnings and continued as before. Cleanliness was still defined by clothing and manners, not by invisible hygiene. As long as hair appeared tidy, what lived within it did not matter. It fascinates me how the Victorians confused order with purity, brushing filth into neat lines and calling it grace. The smell of hair oil filled every room, mixed with sweat and powder. It formed a film that clung to combs and brushes alike. Over time, the tools themselves took on a scent, a faint sweetness overlaid with decay. In crowded homes, this smell was familiar, even comforting. Families sat together by the light of candles, each taking turns with the same comb before bed. Hair fell in soft clumps onto worn rugs, and the day ended with a full sense of care. The act united them, binding love and ignorance in equal measure. When illness spread through a household, it often began at the scalp. Fungal infections caused flaking, sores, and bald spots, yet few connected them to their tools. They treated symptoms with herbal rinses, never suspecting that the culprit sat innocently on the dresser. Washing the comb seemed pointless when everyone shared the same condition. Poverty made such logic inevitable. Even in wealthier homes, where appearances mattered most, hygiene ended at the surface. Hair was meant to shine, not to be sterile. By the late century, advertisements for personal combs began to appear, promising individual refinement. But habits changed slowly. People still found comfort in sharing what had always been shared. The idea of ownership extended to jewellery and gloves, not to hygiene. It took generations